Thank you, everybody, for dialing in. Calvin, a huge thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Hope everybody had a nice holiday season. Definitely on my end. It was my first time seeing my mom after about 2.5 years and her first time coming to Singapore. So that made for a very special holiday season for me. And I hope everybody was able to spend some time with loved ones and really enjoy it and recharge for the year ahead. Our session today is on being your own activist and leading with intentionality. I'm really excited for this conversation. As a few quick housekeeping. We'll begin with a moderated Q&A session between Calvin and myself, and then we'll leave plenty of time for audience Q&A. So that really will be the bulk of the conversation. So please do feel free to ask anything that's top of mind for you. We want this to be a very genuine, intimate, and open conversation. And at the end of the session, I'll close with office hours. And for those who haven't tuned in before, basically, I'll stick on the line to answer any questions that people have, regardless of whether it's connected to the topic or not, and I'll allocate as much time as I can to that as well. So in order to ask questions, it'd be great if you could raise your virtual hand just to know that we have a question, or you can also type your questions into the chat, which I'll be moderating. And then if you're open to turning on videos, it always makes for a warmer discussion, but of course that's optional, so no worries if unable to. To speak a little bit about the topic itself in terms of living with greater intentionality, minimizing chance. Part of this came from while I was getting my MBA at Harvard Business School. I had the opportunity to work with the head of research and a handful of students to create a course called Crafting Your Life, which was intended to help MBA students think about how they could live with greater intentionality, put guardrails in their life so that they ultimately achieve the things that they set out to do and have a little bit more clarity as they're navigating life. So as a part of that process, I had about 120 or so conversations with HBS alumni where we delved into this as well as other topics. And so that's a bit of what has informed this conversation, but definitely something that I've thought a lot about and something that timely given it is the start of the year. So on this topic of living with greater intention, I think if there are three questions that I find helpful in thinking through this topic, one is, what level of awareness do I have around how I'm actually spending my time? Two is clarity on why I'm choosing to spend my time in a certain way. And three is what guardrails I put in place. And you might hear me say guardrails a lot of times throughout the presentation. So to give a few examples of what I mean by guardrails, let's say that you're starting a company while working and doing a full-time job on the side. Examples of guardrails could be writing a vision board somewhere in your place that you're going to see every single day, or telling close friends about what your ambitions are so that when you're having conversations, they remind you. Guardrails are basically anything that you do that structurally sets yourself up to actually do the things that you say you're going to do, which is a way of living with greater intention. So we'll talk about all of these things in a little bit more detail throughout the presentation. But to kick things off, maybe I'll just begin by introducing Calvin really quickly. So he's a HBS classmate of mine. He went to University of Illinois, started his career out at investment banking at JP Morgan, then went and did private equity at Madison Dearborn Partners before getting his MBA at HBS, which is how the two of us know each other. But really, besides the titles and the accolades, because I think that Calvin has certainly been able to do a lot. But I think besides these titles, what I really admire about him is just a tremendous amount of grit and ambition and resourcefulness, which I know he'll speak a lot about in terms of how you actually get from point A to point B. And if it's something, as an example, going from a non-target school, there's not a lot of people that go from University of Illinois into a top tier investment bank. So really how you claw your way, do something like that. I think that, Calvin's one of those people that his minds are always turning and really intentional about what he does. So I know that this is going to make for a really good discussion. And maybe to kick things off, Calvin, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. It'd be great if you could just share a little bit more about yourself, and also if you could also share a perspective on, I know one of the things you often encourage people to do is be their own activists. So if you could share a little bit of context in terms of what you mean when you say that.
Thank you so much, Triston, for the kind words. And for the benefit of the audience, my name is Calvin Liou. Triston and I were classmates at Harvard Business School. And I got to know Triston during my 2 years there. He's an extraordinary leader, was our student body president, and a tremendous mentor and friend. And we catch up kind of once quarterly, and we were talking about the topic of intentionality. And I was like, I kind of do that too. And so we got to talking more, and then he tricked me into doing this event But joking aside, Triston really is a tremendous force of nature, and happy of course to do this. So maybe I'll start a little bit with the definition of what I mean by activist, and when people talk about activism, what they mean. And I think there's kind of two perspectives I have on how one can live life. You can let life happen to you, or you can take life by the horns and do certain things and be more aggressive and be more proactive and be more hardworking, and be more diligent and make things happen for yourself. And so I think about my background. I didn't know what investment banking was. I split my childhood between the US, and I spent 10 years living in Taiwan. And when I went to the University of Illinois, I had a choice. I could kind of go with the flow. And for those of you who are on the line from University of Illinois, you'll know that the big four, right? KPMG, Deloitte, E&Y, and PwC kind of have bought and paid for our business school. And so you'll see the names of the big four everywhere you go. And that's naturally where the recruiting funnel goes. So if you don't think too hard about it and you kind of defer into the status quo, you find yourself at one of these big four firms. And then 10 or 15 years later, you're a manager, a senior manager, and you look back and you wonder, is this what I really wanted? Or could the path have been a little bit different? And so out of pure chance, I found out what investment banking was, and I asked myself, like, do I want to work a job where I'm working 100 hours a week, and it's going to be terrible for my health and it's going to be terrible for my mental sanity, but it's a tremendous opportunity to learn a bunch about finance? And I decided, okay, I think I'm going to go for it. Now, the problem at Illinois at the time was that there was no pathway. There was no dedicated kind of track to get into investment banking. And so in order to get my start on Wall Street, I had to cold email probably 200 people who either at the time or at some point in their careers had worked on Wall Street, who had gone to University of Illinois or some other Big Ten school. And you know, I always remember the people from Indiana were really helpful. The people from Michigan, Notre Dame, not as helpful. But it was all of these cold emails that encouraged people to, if they were feeling charitable about it, respond and tell me about their career path. And through that, I learned about the classes they took, the preparations that they did, the people that they spoke with, the newspapers that they read. And I kind of emulated myself on that basis. But it took a tremendous amount of hustle, because Goldman and JP Morgan and Morgan Stanley and Deutsche Bank, they didn't come to University of Illinois at the time. And so the way I thought about it was every maybe 10 people I'd reach out to, there'd be one person who would actually email me back. And every, 5 or 6 conversations I'd have, maybe it would lead to one interview. And that's kind of how I clawed my way into Wall Street. And it was certainly a numbers game. And so as I look back on that particular experience, it was very much a proactive effort, because if I didn't go and cold email and put myself out there, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to interview. And if I didn't get the opportunity to interview, then I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do the internship. If I didn't do the internship, I wouldn't have got the offer. And if I didn't get the offer today, I'd be at KPMG today, and Triston and I wouldn't have known each other. And nothing against KPMG, great firm. Both my wife, Shelly, and I have done internships there, and Shelly spent the first few years of her career at KPMG. But my point is not to draw, a superiority for one or the other, but rather it was by intention that I made the decision to take a more activist stance on my career, and that's paid big dividends. And when Triston and I were talking, we touched on the topic of living and navigating life with intention. And it's not just professional, but it's also how you think about approaching life on the personal front, because I think the two are very much integrated. And so it would be great, Triston, if you're able to tell me or tell us, for the benefit of the group, a little bit about how you think about navigating your life with this sort of intention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you give the example of the very clear way in which it can be beneficial in terms of charting your career, but I think a lot of these things that we're discussing have a lot of personal applications as well. And I think it's an ongoing journey. So when I think about intention for me, a lot of it is really how am I making sure that I'm consistently getting better every single day. So I want to make sure that, Tuesday I do a better job than I did on Monday in terms of how I'm actually spending my time. And is that consistent with what's important to me? And then, Thursday I try and do a better job that I did at that on Wednesday and so forth. And I really think that making good use of time starts with being aware of how you're spending it. And that may sound obvious, but I think that many people actually spend a good portion of their day doing activities where they're more or less on autopilot, not really realizing what is taking up the majority of your time. So if you haven't done an exercise where at the end of the week or at the end of the month, you actually go back and do an audit on your time to ask yourself, was this I carved out 2 or 3 hours and I was just sending emails, or I spent, this amount of time and I was just sifting through LinkedIn or something like that, and asking yourself, okay, was that actually a good use of my time? And I think that then allows you to transition from awareness into, actual clarity around how you're spending your time. And then one thing that I've always found really helpful in terms of that clarity around the time is having what I like to think of as a personal mission statement. And so for me, a big personal mission statement is, how do I help people reach their full potential? And that sounds very high level, but I could probably speak for 60 minutes straight just in terms of what I actually mean by that. And what it allows me to do is anytime an activity or something pops up into my head, like, oh, I could do this with my time, I can ask myself, is this consistent with what I'm actually the direction I'm actually trying to take my life? And then even when it comes to spending time with people, everything doesn't need to necessarily accomplish a goal, but everything should serve, in my mind, everything should serve a purpose, right? And so if that is spending time with a person just makes you feel good, it makes you feel happy, it makes you feel loved, whatever it might be, that's really important to allocate the time there too. But there's a purpose to that time. And I think that you just be aware of it and allocate it. And then really from intention to action in my mind is once you can start to set up guardrails. So, let's say that there's somebody that you want to be spending more time with, but you don't actually spend as much time as you would want. So Calvin had mentioned that at the beginning of the call, he had mentioned that him and I made a point to speak up or to chat with each other at least quarterly, right? So we put a reoccurring calendar invite on each other's schedules so that it's going to, and he's laughing because we, sometimes we miss that. I'd say we do talk more than 4 times a year, so we achieved the quarterly goal. But we don't always hit the actual time, but it doesn't matter if you hit the time because it's just a reminder in terms of, hey, this is a person that I know I want to spend time with. Let me actually, reach out to them, see how things are going. So that, again, is the example of the guardrail. And so I'd really encourage people to develop that awareness, tie that awareness to what you're trying to accomplish, and then put those guardrails in place so that structurally you're set up to actually do these things that you say you want to do and that are very important to you. That's been my formula. It's been really helpful for me. And yeah, I'd love to hear. So that's more so thinking about it from a personal lens. Calvin, I'd love to
Triston,
hear.
really quickly, just wanted to interrupt. So I'm laughing because Triston and I really hit it off in business school, and he's like, we should stay in touch. I was like, yeah, I'd be delighted to stay in touch. And that's just the polite thing you say to everybody. But it was actually through that set of interactions that I realized just how disciplined and how intentional and how ruthless, and I mean that in a good way, Triston is about his time and what he chooses to do. Because immediately when Triston got back to his apartment, I received like 8 calendar invites for the next 8 quarters. And I didn't know, I didn't know where we would be 2 years out. I didn't know that I'd have a kid. I didn't know what kind of job I'd have. But I think that's the level of discipline, and that's the level of intentionality, and that's the level of kind of thoughtfulness that Triston applies. So sorry to interrupt, but that's why I was laughing.
No, I appreciate that. It's a helpful build, but I would definitely say that, yeah, not only making people aware that you want to spend the time with them, but taking that step to actually carve that time out and put it on their calendar, I think is a really it's a good way of making sure that you're actually doing and seeing the people that you want to spend the time with. But Calvin, I'd love to hear from your perspective around, translating why this mindset of intentionality is so impactful if we think about it in the lens of really setting yourself up for success, and how preparation can be a way of minimizing chance so that you're not leaving things up to luck. So from your perspective, how do you think about preparation? And maybe it'd be helpful if you could share an example of something that was really important to you and how you went about actually preparing for that.
Yeah, sure. So I think luck is a funny thing, right? Because in some sense, we're all very, very lucky, right? We're born into the families that we're born into. We have the opportunity to access running water and the electricity and the education that we've had. But at the same time, luck is very much something that you create for yourself. And my mindset, I guess, since I got to college was very much, how do I leave as little to luck as possible? How do I maximize my chance of success? And thinking back to high school, I applied to a bunch of colleges and ended up at the University of Illinois. And Illinois was the safety school for my high school. It was where all the dumb kids went. And so I very much have had that chip on my shoulder ever since. And, this is not like a counseling session where I'll tell you all about my deepest, darkest fears. But when I applied to HBS, all of those thoughts and memories and emotions kind of came back to me. And I was like, what should I do differently this time that I didn't do when I was applying for undergraduate institutions? And thankfully, I got the interview. And when I got the interview, I had read somewhere that 50% of the people who get the interview get in and 50% don't. And I was like, okay, well, maybe this is an opportunity for me to think about how I could best prepare myself for success, because now there are 2,000 of us across the country and across the world who have been granted this interview at the Harvard Business School, and 1,000 of us are going to get bad news, right, in a few weeks. And so I literally went gangbusters. So I wrote down every possible question I could get asked. I purchased guides that would kind of walk you through experiences that people who have interviewed for business schools in the past to talk about that. So I read through every single guide. Beyond just writing down every possible question I could get asked, I wrote down my answer to every question, and I sat in front of the mirror like an idiot every day, and I rehearsed question, answer, question, answer. I was talking to myself. And I also did mock interviews with Shelly, my wife, who's a great reality check, right? Because often it's the people closest to you who will tell the truth. And sometimes she'd be like, Calvin, that's a stupid answer, or Calvin, you should say this instead. And she really helped me soften my tone, because I can often be very aggressive and very upfront. And beyond that, at the company that I was working at, there were 4 or 5 alums of HBS, and I asked them to do a mock interview. And so I recorded myself as they were asking me questions. I recited my answers, and there were some questions that I hadn't prepared for. And they were questions that they received when they were interviewing several years ago. And so I truly left nothing up to chance. It was to the point where, and I know this just sounds completely psycho, but the week before the interview, I booked a hotel room about a mile away from campus, and I checked in, and I made sure that the week after, it was the same hotel room. So I went and talked to the general manager. I'm like, I'd like this exact same hotel room. And this is the sort of thing that you hear from, like professional athletes who have these like stupid superstitions. And I made sure to time my walk from the hotel room to campus exactly a week before on the same day, and just, left literally nothing up to chance. And when I got into the interview room, there was not a single question that I received that I think I hadn't prepped for in some way, shape, or form. And because I had done it so much, it was at a level of fluency where the answers came off as quite natural and not scripted. And I even had the room to ask a question or two and to make a lighthearted joke or two. And I think that if I had gone with the advice that HBS gives you, which is be yourself and don't take this too seriously, and just kind of let your story tell itself, I don't know if I would have met Triston. So I look back on this, and it's extreme for sure. but I think it is on brand and consistent with this intentionality, with this be your own activist, with this mindset that you kind of want to leave nothing up to chance and maximize your success. Because I go back to it. There are two ways to live life. You can let life happen to you, or you can take life by the horns and do something differently. And that's what I chose to do in that particular instance. And Triston, I was thinking about getting into HBS, and we have talked quite a bit about this. And I know you were very intentional about how you spent your time on campus. So maybe you could tell the group a little bit about how you planned the way that you were going to spend this chapter of your life, and how you were so detailed about doing it before you even got to campus, and kind of what that entailed.
Yeah, I definitely allocated a lot of time, I think, to thinking about that before getting to campus. But what I really want to maybe underscore before talking about that, about what you just shared, is the process that you described as a process that worked for you as an individual. And of course, everybody on the call is going to have a different process in terms of how they prepare for things. So some people are going to hear the way that you're prepared, and they're going to say, I love it, I'm going to prepare just that way. Some people, as you pointed out, are probably going to hear your description and say that's excessive. There's no reason I'm going to book a hotel a week in advance and time my walk to campus. But what is so impactful about it is you're very clear on what your process is to get your own confidence level to the point where you're going to step in the room and you're going to do well in that interview. And I think that for me, when I think about minimizing chance and being intentional, is the real objective there. It's that clarity that you have as to why you're carving out that extra time, because it just puts you in the right headspace to know that when you walk in that room and you sit down in front of that person that you're interviewing with, that you feel confident you've done everything that you can do. So for everybody, I'd say the process doesn't really matter. Your process might look very different from Calvin's, but I think what does matter and what's applicable for everybody is what are the steps that you're taking that then put you in the mindset to walk into rooms with full confidence that you've done everything that you can do to set yourself up to be as successful as possible in that conversation that you're going to have. Whether you're pitching
Triston, on that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I had that. So on that point, right? I remember, you're never going to know, right? Like what the counterfactual was, right? Like I don't have like a clone version of myself in an alternate universe that prepped less, and I'd be able to see if that person got into HBS or not. But I remember our first day of class where we had to go around and say something interesting about ourselves, and of course it turned into like this massive brag fest. In my section there was a guy who was in the Israeli army, and he had spied on the Palestinians, and he created this sort of reconnaissance technology. So he talked a little bit about that. Without jeopardizing the confidentiality stuff. There was a woman who had gone on Shark Tank. There was a guy who had like 3 or 4 patents to his name. There was another guy who had started a company. There was a woman who had been at much more prestigious firms than I had. And when it got to my turn, I really didn't have that much to say, because I was like, gosh, I didn't patent anything. I haven't been on Shark Tank. I haven't started a company. And the one interesting thing about me was I was getting married that week. And so that was the one thing I said, because that was literally the most compelling thing about who I was as a student. And in the moment, I was like, damn, I'm really glad I prepped for this interview, because if I had not done that and just kind of gone in blind, like who knows what would have happened. Sorry, Triston, just a thought that popped up.
Yeah. So connected to this, I think that intentionality, preparing and setting yourself up for an opportunity. So the flip side of that is, once you have that opportunity, then how do you leverage intention to actually, maximize what you get out of the experience? So if I think about what my experience was in terms of, business school is a very defined chapter of life, because it's going to be 2 years. But oftentimes when we step into and when we navigate roles, we do move into defined periods. So you might be working within your company and be given an international assignment, and that's going to be a defined period of time. I think school, exactly how long it's going to be, whereas when you get out and you're working, maybe you don't have as much clarity in terms of the actual time blocks. But when approaching these different chapters of life, I always try to, the analogy that comes to mind for me is thinking about the way that And an EDM DJ, EDM for those who aren't familiar, electronic dance music, the way that an EDM DJ might prepare for a set that they're about to deliver at a venue, they would come up with their lineup in terms of the songs that they're going to play and so forth. They might make some modifications once they're actually performing, maybe based on the audience reaction. They'll add a little bit of lights, they'll add a little bit of smoke, they'll add a little bit of special effects, but more or less, the plan they have is set when they stepped into that DJ booth. And that's kind of how I thought about, if we use HBS as an example, that's the way that I thought about this chapter. It was very defined. I knew what I wanted to do, and I knew that once I got to campus, I was going to make some slight modifications, but I more or less had the plan in place. And that planning and intention, that's what allowed me to maximize the experience. So, from a goals perspective, I knew at a high level, I could be abstract about it. And I knew at a high level, I wanted to meet as many of my classmates as possible. I wanted to set myself up for success professionally, and I wanted to gain as much international exposure as possible. So those were kind of like the high level umbrella. These are the overarching things that are important to me. But then I think that proactiveness is taking that level of these are my high level goals to thinking about, okay, now what are going to be the channels for being able to actually achieve these things? And so for me, those channels were, serving as the co-president of my class, serving as an education rep for my section, which is basically the liaison between the classmates and the professors, landing a job. I knew that I wanted to go into management consulting. So landing a job at a management consulting firm with a particular focus on BCG, Bain, and McKinsey, and spending as much time abroad as possible. These were kind of like channels that I would help me achieve those goals. And all of these things I actually knew before I submitted my application. Again, this is another example that to some people, they might think that this is excessive planning, but this is the process that worked for me. And this is why I did it this way. But I knew that this was how I planned on spending my time in MBA before I actually applied to HBS. And so I knew that like those goals, every one of those, I had actually, in the first draft of the application statement that I wrote to HBS, I kind of put those goals. And then when I talked to some mentors, they were like, that's way too specific. Don't say that you want to do these things, because then what if you don't actually show up to campus and accomplish those? Does that mean that your experience has failed? And I see that that's a theme emerging in the chat box. So we can talk about that a bit later. But I think that it was that tangible goals that allowed me to then prioritize how I spend time, because everybody talks about, fear of missing out, FOMO. And I think that how you spend your time and how you prioritize, because it's not just about, I want to spend time on 1, 2, and 3, but it's also, I want to spend time on 1, 2, and 3. And in order to make time for those things, I'm not going to spend time on A, B, and C. Right. So what are you going to, like, happy hours is an example for me. I'm an introverted person. I'm soft spoken. I don't really like being in large settings with loud music. When people think about meeting people in a business school setting, they oftentimes are thinking about happy hours, bars, and clubs. Going into HBS, I knew that I really didn't go to happy hours very often. And I knew that that wasn't going to be a channel where I personally got to know people based on, what my comfort level is and how I like to meet people. So I just completely removed that from even my consideration set of how I was going to spend my time, and actually did free up a lot of time for me to be able to reallocate that elsewhere. So I think that is where this planning can really help turn some of this intention into action, which is my goal with a lot of these. And mindful of time, so we'll turn it over to Q&A very shortly. But before doing that, Calvin, maybe one last question, just around a lot of this conversation so far has been around how we've applied these principles in terms of setting ourselves up for success in our own life. But I know a lot of what you think about, you care deeply about your family, you care deeply about causes, and a lot of what you think about is actually how you can help other people. And I think that this mindset of being a mindset of intentionality can also be applied towards not only setting yourself up for success, but being proactive about helping to change somebody else's life. So how do you think about that through the lens of how you can be intentional and proactive to benefit somebody else?
Yeah. Putting me a little bit on the spot here. I mean, I can I really enjoy watching other people succeed. And maybe what I'm about to say is egotistical, but I really enjoy having a hand in someone else's success. And so to know that this person has done well and this person has accomplished his or her goals in part because of some little thing that I've done, I mean, that's extraordinary to me. And so one example I can think of is there was a woman named Drashonda in the building that I used to live in Chicago. And she was the part-time door woman, the part-time door person. And I don't know if you guys know about the hierarchy of building management, but you have the building manager, you have the assistant building manager, and then you have like the lead doorman or doorwoman, and then all the other door people, and then the porters and the janitors. And then at the very bottom, you have like a part-time door person. And that person literally has the worst job because there's no benefits. It's an hourly wage. They only get paid when they work, and they only work when somebody else calls in sick. And generally that sort of, calls in sick sort of thing lends itself to a very unpredictable work schedule. So like some weeks you might have double shifts, some weeks you might have no shifts at all. And it's just like, that's a very terrible job because there's no stability in your income. There's no stability in your schedule. And I'd gotten to know this woman, African-American woman, had a master's degree from a local university in psychology. And I was just like, what are you doing this job? You're well educated. You have a master's. And she's like, well, I have a kid. And, sometimes you just have to make sacrifices to support your child. It was just like very heartbreaking to hear about this. And so, and not to mention, she was also extraordinary at her job. She was attentive. I actually thought she was a better door person than some of the full-time door people. And so we had built this friendship. And then out of the blue, our assistant building manager quits. And again, recall, assistant building manager is above everybody except for the actual building manager, right? And I was like, hey, Trishonda, I think you should apply for this. And she's like, I've got no shot. There's 15 people before me in line, and I'm Black and I'm a woman. And I was just like, no, you've got to apply for this. And so we sat down, and you've heard this story before. We created a list of every possible interview question that she could get. And I was like, go home, go talk to yourself in front of the mirror, rehearse these questions, and we'll let God handle the rest. And I'm not playing God certainly, but I was like, I've got to hustle to do all I can to get this woman this job, right? So I went and found the vice president of the publicly traded company who has a division that does these building management services, and he happened to be in Chicago. And I was like, hey, Kirk, we've got to sit down. You don't know me, I don't know you, but I'm a resident in one of your buildings, and I have a recommendation for someone who I think would be a great fit. And we sat down, we had a great productive conversation. I told him all about Trishonda and how she'd be a great fit for the job, how the building residents already liked her, and how I thought that it could add diversity to the team, and she was responsible. And she has a master's degree. I mean, it's unbelievable. And then behind the scenes, I went and lobbied. I literally knocked on doors in my building to see who could sign this letter of recommendation I had prepared for her, right? Just so he'd have something to show for when he's trying to interview her, and there's a committee of people who decide who ends up getting the job. So we got a bunch of heavy hitters in our building to sign this letter of recommendation. And it was the head of pension at BP, the guy who ran the private equity firm that I worked for. And now you guys think I lived in a super expensive building. It was expensive. I had the smallest unit in the building, and all these people had 2-3 bedrooms facing the lake. But ultimately that's what we ended up doing. And it was a group of us, a big cohort of us who were supporting her. And she didn't know any of this. All she knew was, I'm kind of stuck in this situation. I'm going to do my best to prepare. And this is kind of what I mean by luck favors the well-prepared, because at the end of the day, it was luck that we lived in a building where this sort of thing mattered. And it was luck that she and I had gotten to know each other. And I was, I decided I was going to be extremely annoying and try to get her this job. But she was also well prepared, because when she sat down for the interview, if she had all these tailwinds and fought during the interview, I don't know if she would have gotten the job. So I very much maintain a philosophy of helping others, and I very much like it when other people succeed. And I think back to the cold emails that I wrote, right? If Jeff Studi, who ran the healthcare group at JP Morgan, didn't respond to my email when I was a sophomore and knew nothing, right? There's no way that I would have been able to make it to Wall Street and do a good job for him, and so on and so forth. And likewise, I think that I very much apply this activist bent when I think about mentoring others and helping others. Triston, I don't know. I'm talking your ear off. What do you think?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that my takeaway from this is the same intentionality that you apply to yourself. You can also help somebody else by doing the same, help somebody else by, taking that proactiveness and giving them a nudge, even in this case, just showing them that there's this group of people within the building that care, or even that you as an individual care enough to carve out the time, think about these questions and so forth, can really make a difference in terms of how somebody else sees themselves pursuing an opportunity and so forth. And I think, that ability to set somebody else up for success is, of course, something that very much inspires me as well. If I think about, within my own family as a first generation college student, if I think about my outcome and the experiences that I've been fortunate to have relative to my oldest brother, who, lived the early part of his adult life kind of below the poverty line and had a much more difficult time than me. But if I think about, okay, this proactive mindset, how can I actually apply this? In 2016, I was able to purchase a place for him. And, that was a very intentional decision in terms of the way in which I wanted to help him, because I felt like it gave him, some of the basic necessities, like an access to a kitchen so that he could have, hopefully stop eating out so much, because, health was becoming an issue and so forth. I would think of little tasks that I could share with them. So, when I was hosting these events, and I used to do these events in New York, and I used to reach out to college students in the New York area to see if they were interested in attending. And so I would give my brother $20 an hour to go on LinkedIn and to actually send these messages out. Yes, it was giving him $20 an hour, but also it was giving him an excuse to use a computer, which is something that he wasn't really using a computer. So that was a new skill to learn. And so I think that same proactiveness you apply for yourself can also be proactiveness that you then use to put somebody else and set them up for success. So that definitely resonates. And Calvin, this is also one of the big things, of course, that has resonated with me about you as well. And for context, I can't remember when this was. Maybe it was a year and a half ago or so. But Calvin reached out to me and he was like, "Hey, my younger brother Gary, who's also on the line, he was like, "Hey, my younger brother Gary, I think that if he could just have a little bit of exposure to the way that you think, I think it would help him in some areas. So, would it be all right if, I know you do these Zoom events, would it be all right if Gary helps you out with some of these Zoom events? He can organize stuff in the background. He can be a brainstorming partner. You can just call him. You can talk about these events. It doesn't really matter what it is. I just want, Gary to talk to you every now and then." So structurally, Calvin is now setting his brother up for success, just making this introduction, giving a few ideas in terms of how we might interact and so forth. And, Gary, I feel like I've had almost as many chances to chat with in the past couple of years as I had with Calvin. And it's been really helpful to have him brainstorming a lot of these events, including the one today, but many of the other ones that I've done, just as a thought partner in a lot of this stuff. So, Calvin has set this up in a way that his brother's going to benefit from it. I'm going to benefit from it. And it just, that is really, examples of guardrails and just really structurally setting things up. So with that, we ran longer than I anticipated in terms of this opening portion. I want to leave a lot of time for moderated Q&A, but maybe right before pivoting to moderated Q&A, Gary, I'm curious from your perspective, actually, now that we're talking about it, if I could just bring you into the conversation. Gary, I'm curious about, is there anything either that we didn't touch on or any, question that you have maybe to kick off the Q&A period?
Yeah, no, thanks, Triston, and thanks for the shout out of Calvin helping me get this this connection with you. The only thing that comes to mind that I think would be helpful for the forum to kind of hear or to discuss in this forum would be kind of the importance of networking, and there's a reason why it's top of mind for me. So in my industry right now, more students and other people who work at other jobs have been reaching out at this time, maybe because of banking's recruiting cycle or whatnot. And looking at my colleagues and looking at myself, it's been interesting to see the dichotomy of opinions that my colleagues have with regard to taking these calls and spending the time to network with people. And you, both Calvin and Triston, have benefited tremendously from their own networks as a result of their own investment over time. And you both know how hard it is to build out those relationships. It's a huge time commitment. But you're also very generous with your time, not only in the forums like these, but also just individual relationships with people that you've want to help. Like Calvin wants to help other people. He wants to invest his time. Triston, you take so much of your time to do these types of forums to guide people through, things that you've learned in your career. And, it's just that this is something that's been top of mind because, I think one thing that you two both really have in common is this quality. And it's what attracts you to other people. And is also a key driver to your success. People know that if they come to you, they can rely on you, and you are more than willing to help those who are trying to help themselves, who have the activist bent in themselves. I think, like, I might not be able to speak for Triston, but if somebody cold emailed Calvin and followed up with him diligently, like, he would do everything in his power to help those people, right? And that's a quality that I feel like a lot of people don't necessarily have when they first network, and maybe after they've gone to where they are, they don't necessarily adapt that and pay it forward. So that's just something that I noticed you both do tremendously well, and it's probably something that people should keep top of mind as they, get into positions where they should be helping other people after receiving the benefits themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Gary.
Reflecting on that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Calvin.
Go ahead, Triston.
No, your brother. You got dibs here.
All right. Well, I mean, that was a terrible thing to say, Gary. I think that was well said. A couple things come to mind just as bits of practical advice, and I recognize a lot of folks on this call are more peers, right, than people that I can impart wisdom on. But one thing that's worked well for me when talking to people that I stand to benefit a lot from is that, don't be a stranger, right? If you've asked someone for help in the past, kind of keep them posted, share the success with them. So there are people who I've kept in touch with who, I asked for a networking call back when I was a sophomore or junior in college, and they were extremely helpful. And I still keep them posted on things that have happened in my life. So like, hey, I got into Harvard. Hey, I'm going back to private equity. Hey, I just had a child. I mean, these are like tactical things to help continue the relationship. So it's not that every time you're reaching out, you're truly asking for something. And then just a general philosophy I have. I do very much believe that especially when we are the beneficiaries of so many people who have been generous with their time, when there are other people who are asking you for your time and your help and counsel, to the extent that you're able to, just pay it forward. Triston?
Yeah, no, I think that resonates in terms of the message of paying it forward. And I really don't view it as like a zero-sum thing. I think by helping other people, you're also setting yourself up for success. And good things will come of it. So, these Zoom events, I genuinely enjoy doing the Zoom events. For me, it's also an opportunity to practice my communication and my public speaking skills, which are instrumental, foundational things for the type of impact that I want to be able to have. It gives me the ability to practice my writing through the articles that I post on LinkedIn. So I'm bettering myself in the process of putting this content and the information out there. And then on top of that, it's just been a forum for me to meet new and interesting people and everything like that, and really strike up conversations that are also helpful for myself, right? We have a conversation, there's 70 plus people that tune in for the conversation, and some of the questions that will arise will force me to think in a way that will increase, on this topic of intentionality, increase the thoughtfulness that I take in terms of how I'm spending my time and so forth. So there's a woman who's a vice chairman at Morgan Stanley. Her name's Carla Harris, and one of the things that she would say very often, and she even has it as a tagline within her bio, is I have been blessed so that I can be a blessing to others. And she's just an incredible example of somebody who tremendous accolades professionally, but has really carved out the time, exactly as you're saying, has never in her career felt like, okay, I'm now too busy to make time for helping other people. And as long as the people who are approaching her are doing what they need to do on their end to set themselves on success, she's willing to kind of play that part in terms of getting them that extra mile and so forth. So really good point and good question, Gary. And so with that, would love to open the floor up to Q&A. Maybe Erica, I see you posed a question in the chat, so maybe I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, Triston. Great seeing you again, and thank you, Calvin, as well, for sharing your experiences, as well as inviting your brother as well to moderate everything. This is actually my first event, and actually this is the first time I've seen Triston in the last, it's been a while. I'd say almost 5 years now. So we both met in Chengdu back in 2017, and that's where I got to know him during my study abroad experience and just meeting other students like myself. Anyway, before I do my question, so I wrote in the chat box about how do you discipline yourself when it comes to time management?
Calvin, maybe I can take this one and feel free to build. In terms of time management, I think one of the things that's been really helpful is there's a few things that have been really helpful. I'd say one is a daily habit of journaling. I'd say two has been therapy and going to therapy, which is something I've done on a regular basis, I guess on and off for the past for the past 10 years or so. And then the third being have what I call my life map, which all three of these things integrate into each other. And I'll kind of talk through that in a second. The first in terms of, and maybe I'll go in reverse order. The life map is basically a one-page document that I have, which is everything that's important to me on one page. And it's a time management and a prioritization tool for me, because if it's not on that page, I know that it's not particularly important to me. And it allows me to, when something pops into my calendar as like something that I could spend my time on, or when somebody texts me something that could take my attention, I'm immediately thinking back to what do I have on that piece of paper, and should I be spending my time on this? Yes or no. And so that is a prioritization tool. The way that ties into journaling is every morning I like to start my day before I check my email, before I check my phone, social media, anything like that. The first thing that I do is I will journal and I'll write down what's on my head, because I view that time in that morning is the purest thoughts that are on my mind and what's really important to me, versus emails, social media. That is all content that other people are trying to put into your head and to get you to focus on. So when I go and I write in that journal and I capture what's top of mind for me, I then compare what I wrote on that day to what's in the life map. And it's almost like a correction process for myself. Like, am I going to spend today in a way that's consistent with how I've decided I want to be spending my time in this chapter of my life? And then that third block that I mentioned, therapy, I think that for me is the bigger ticket items, the things that are very important. Just having an outlet that I can take a step back and say, okay, at a very high level, how are things going? How could they be going better? What is draining my energy? What's stressing me out? What feels like it's missing from my life? So in many ways, those therapy sessions will mold what ends up going into the life map. If I feel like I'm not leaving enough time for sleep, if I feel like I'm not leaving my nutrition or whatever it might be, some of these conversations are things that will emerge in one of these therapy conversations, and then I'll bring it back into the life map to, again, I view that as a guardrail for me, because that's what's going to inform my daily habits. And so I'd say those three things, it's kind of a cycle that helps me with my my prioritization process. Calvin, I'm not sure if you have, I'm sure you have a different approach. I'm not sure if you have anything to build on that.
Much less intentional than you are. I also keep a journal. And I guess the one thing that I also do is I do pray on a pretty consistent basis, and whether or not you believe in God, and whether it's like prayer or meditation, there are a number of secular benefits to it psychologically, to demonstrating gratitude and to ask for things. And I think it's a way to keep me grounded. And I'm pretty bad at time management now. Now that we've had a kid, we've received a tremendous amount of help from Shelly and her folks. And so that's something that I'm still very much a work in progress there.
There's a good amount of questions that came through in the chat. Connie, if you're on the line, do you want to unmute your line and share your question?
Yeah, absolutely, Tristan. And thank you so much, Calvin, for being here. I was wondering, Tristan, you mentioned you said the goals, very detailed and specific, even before you entered HBS. I was wondering if you could extrapolate that a little bit and share, how much details do you go into and how do you include flexibility around, your goals?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of setting those goals and the flexibility that comes with it, I think each of the goals are tied to a theme, right? So one of my goals was to, become student body president, but the theme was meet my classmates. And there's 100 different ways that I could be able to accomplish the thematic goal. Becoming student body president, that's just one channel, one outlet. And the reason that was really important for me, again, I think the why is really important in a lot of these things. And for me, the why was because I am introverted. I feel very uncomfortable approaching somebody and introducing myself to the first time. So being in student government is a way that structurally it guaranteed I was going to meet a lot of my classmates. So I'd say accomplish the thematic goals because there's so many avenues for meeting my classmates. I knew that if I had ran for, student government and I didn't end up getting elected, it would have been fine because, my things would have turned out differently, but I would have found other ways to meet classmates and I would have gone back to the drawing board and so forth. So I think that that's where the flexibility comes into the picture. It's not necessarily overly anchoring myself on an outcome, but more so anchoring myself on what am I at a high level trying to achieve? And then thinking about various channels that can get me there so that I can, if I don't hit a particular outcome, I don't get too disheartened by that. I don't view it as a failure. I remind myself of the bigger goal. So, people always talk about like SMART goals, specific, you need to be able to measure them, action oriented, there are those SMART goals within there, but at a one level higher, there's always thematic goals. And that tends to be how I think about that balance between the specificity of it while also leaving room for flexibility and the reality that things will just pop up.
Can we direct to Sandy's question? Sandy, if you're there.
It's one thing to set goals and, I think everyone faces setback and failures. And in fact, some of the things that are very important to you might also happen to be things that are harder for you. So how do you sort of balance that and then think about what's truly realistic, right? Because I think as a person grows, they are also understanding what's their limit and what's their relative strength. So how do you sort of balance that process?
Yeah, so on the point of failure, right? Like I had the chance to take a look at my resume the other week, and I was thinking, if I had created a resume for my failures, it would literally be 3 times as long as the resume that I have that outlines my accolades. I think about how I didn't get into the undergraduate institution of my choice. No offense to everybody from U of I, ILL, woo. I think about how I didn't get the job offer from the first summer internship I did, right? I worked at Citi, and I don't talk about that on my resume or my LinkedIn. And I think, the 2 practical things I would say is like the more time that you spend feeling sorry for yourself and the more time you spend dwelling on the failure, the more time that you're not kind of investing in yourself and taking that next step forward. So to the extent you can kind of limit that cycle time or that amount of time that you're spending kind of recovering from the failures, I think the more you can put your mind to the productive stuff. The second thing I would say is, there's stuff within your control and stuff outside of your control. And what I'm saying is extremely commonsensical, and it's very easy for me to say this from the outside in. And when you're actually invested in a project or you see a failure live or you're working towards a goal, it's hard to remember this, but I think it's worth saying anyway, which is do what you can, right? Like do your best. And then the rest of it, you need to leave up to God, or you need to leave up to fate or whatever it is that you believe. And you can either worry or trust God, but you can't really do both. And so that's very much been my mindset, right? Like, especially when it comes to failures, it's like, well, I truly did my best. Or I look at myself in the mirror, it's like, actually, I didn't do my best. And here are the things I should have done differently. And that's a tough conversation that one needs to have with him or herself. But beyond that, like, that's all you can do. And it's important to just take things in perspective. Like, I once got into a taxi and I was like, as a matter of just being polite, I was like, hey, how are you doing this morning? And the taxi driver was like, I woke up this morning. And then I was like, is that the end of the sentence? And he was like, yeah, I woke up this morning. I was like, you know what? Like, there are going to be people who don't wake up this morning, right? So like, life is pretty good. The fact that you still have a pulse, you still have a breath, you still have a fighting chance. I think that very much, I know it's silly and cheap, but like, that very much helps put things into perspective as you think about failure. D?
Yeah, no, that resonates, and I'm just mindful of time. I know we're coming up on the hour. Calvin, are you still okay to go for a bit longer? Not to put you on the spot, but
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, I have a
awesome.
few minutes.
Jen, I'll turn it over to you, and then Valentina after that.
Okay, thanks so much, Triston and Calvin. I guess a similar vein of the question on failure. So how do you know when to kind of keep trying down the road? Maybe, I know, Triston, you mentioned about thematic goals, but versus how do you know when to pivot and when it's worth like not trying to continue down that road? I guess there are a few examples with entrepreneurs like that try continuing, and if they succeed, we always celebrate their, the stamina, endurance, but then we also know cases where it doesn't make sense. But I think in other cases also, like when you apply to schools, if you don't get in, like what should we do? So I guess in general, there are a lot of cases where I think this question hopefully applies.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely, and that resonates. And I'd say similar to Calvin, a lot of, failures, and even some of the things that are my successes and titles and accolades and so forth, there were failures kind of before that, right? So if I think about Morgan Stanley, I applied to Morgan Stanley as a sophomore, I got rejected. I applied to Morgan Stanley as a junior and I got the internship. If I think about running for student body president, I ran for student body president when I was in college for the same reason. I knew that I wanted to meet my classmates, and I was very introverted, and structurally I wanted to set myself up to, so I ran for student body president in college, and I didn't win. But then I went to business school. I ran for it again, and I got it the second time around. The first time I applied to BCG after doing my internship at Morgan Stanley and having the full-time offer, I went back and I thought to myself, actually, maybe I would rather start my career off at BCG or in consulting. And I applied to BCG as a college student for a full-time opportunity. Completely bombed the case interviews, didn't get it. Came back as a business school student, got it the second time around. So a lot of these things, it's like you have multiple at bats at a lot of these things, whether it's a company or whether it's a goal, whatever it is, you have a second at bat. So for me, the decision around when to pivot versus when to actually keep at it boils down to the why in terms of how you're spending your time and what you're ultimately working towards. So for me, if I go back to that concept of the life map, like what's on that piece of paper, what am I trying to work towards? If it feels like the energy that I'm putting towards something that I'm trying to accomplish isn't actually a big enough portion of what I'm trying to accomplish with my overall life, then in my mind, it's time to pivot. But if the failures are, giving me learning that is still directionally helping me towards whatever that longer term goal is, if I think about how do I help people reach their full potential, and I'm failing at a bunch of stuff along the way, but at least it's teaching me things that help me towards this overarching goal that hasn't changed, then I'm going to keep at it and I'm going to continue failing as much as I need to. But if I start to realize in that process of failing, I'm really exhausting myself, and then I take a step back and I say, you know what, I actually don't really even need to accomplish this thing. You don't necessarily need to, and I think it can be really for everything that you want to accomplish, there's just multiple channels to doing it. So if you're failing at something, then I also, sometimes I consider, is there a different channel that might give me different access to this thing that I'm trying to accomplish. Calvin, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, or if not, we'll turn it over to.
Yeah, very, very quickly. I love your answer. It's a very intrinsic answer, and I have a more extrinsic answer for you, which is that you should seek outside counsel. Like, given that you are living the failure, you're just too close to it, right? And so I think it's important to get credible opinions and credible advice by people who have done it, by people who have failed, by people who know the situation, and surround yourself, right, with a personal board of directors of people you can trust to give you credible advice. And so my personal board of directors is folks like Triston, folks like Shelly, my wife, who is not shy about saying, hey, you've gained weight, or hey, this is stupid, or hey, don't wear that, or hey, I don't think you should talk to the CEO, you should do this instead. And so by getting this credible advice, then you kind of get out of your own head and you can hear what other people have said. Now, the point about failure, like 10% of the HBS class is people who have been rejected and reapply. And whether or not you have a compelling application for HBS, like nobody's going to know except for the committee, but there are a group of people in the world who have a good sense of whether or not you could possibly get in or not, right? There are admissions consultants you could pay for that sort of advice. There are people like me and Triston who went to HBS, who you could put your application in front of us. And I mean, I don't know any better than anybody else, but for the fact that we did get in, right? But like, there are people that you can seek within your network, or people that you can pay for professional advice. And that's my advice. You should seek outside counsel, because often you're just too close to the endeavor yourself.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Jen, for the question. Valentina?
Hi, thank you for hosting this. The question I had was, does being intentional equal to do just what you want to do? I had this question because sometimes I find being intentional means I have to do things I don't necessarily enjoy doing, but then I just have to do them to get to what I want to do. And I guess it doesn't mean to be a rhetorical question, but I guess what I'm asking is there ways you can find to do the things you have to do but don't like to do?
Yeah. I think that, it's a good question. I think to power through those moments in life, being clear on why and why you're doing something, right? So Calvin earlier gave an example of the fact that when he thought about investment banking, he knew that it was going to be really difficult. He knew that it might, take an impact in terms of his ability to have a diet and be healthy in the way that one might want to be. He knew all of these things before going into investment banking, but there was a why in terms of the learning for doing it. And so I think that for me, the clarity on the why and in my own life, there are always chapters or parts of the day that I'm not going to be excited about, but as long as I understand, like, why am I doing this, then it makes that not only tolerable, but I'm able to find joy in the activity because there's a purpose for it. So it doesn't feel like I'm wasting this energy towards something. So for me, I oftentimes think back to why is it that I'm pursuing something, and that helps me through those moments. But how about you, Calvin?
Yeah, I mean, self-discipline is probably the one thing that I would personally say I struggle with the most. I'm often at odds, right? It's like, I do want to lose weight and be healthy, but like sometimes it feels better to be like a lazy sack of, and just like eat these potato chips. But I think at the end of the day, what it comes down to is like, do you want it badly enough? Right. And wanting it badly enough doesn't mean 100% compliance, 100% self-discipline, 100% success all the time. What it comes down to is consistent daily wins. And like a very tangible example, and I know a number of people on the phone, right? My friend Wendy is a CFA charter holder on the phone. Christine, I know, is pursuing the CFA program. Shelly, my wife, is a CFA charter holder. So I've passed level 2. I don't know if you guys know, CFA is a 3-part exam. And I can't have Shelly being better than me. I mean, that's like kind of a silly thing. So I also want to be a CFA charter holder. And it's like a terrible exam to study for. It's like 300 hours of your time, like grinding through corporate finance concepts. And it's just atrocious. And there are some days where I do a really good job and I log, okay, I studied 3 hours today. There are other days where I say I'm going to study 3 hours and I end up studying nothing at all. But what helps me is having a visualization of the achievement. And so yes, you're not going to win every day, but over time, what I think makes a winner is someone who has consistent daily wins over time, because you're not perfect. We're all human. To achieve our goals is not an easy thing. And so it's just about that perseverance and persistence, and just don't beat yourself up too much when things don't go according to plan.
Hello, thanks for hosting this call. I really appreciate it. So I think this has already been touched on before, but I would like to ask, have there been any situations where you realize that the goal you're trying to attain is not particularly worth it, and how you've been able to change your track and pursue another goal smoothly without any major disruptions, I would say?
I can go first. So I think I'll introduce for those folks who aren't familiar with the concept of sunk cost. And sunk cost is something where you've invested a lot of time and money and energy and emotion in something, and you've ultimately, at some point, you're just like, oh man, I've already like done this, so I might as well keep going, right? And that's a terrible way to make business decisions. That's a terrible way to make personal decisions. And something that, you know, there was a different sector that I was trying to pursue when I was at HBS. And after spending the summer internship in that sector, and after prepping a lot, like hundreds and hundreds of hours to get a job in that sector, I ended up getting a job in that sector. And I also got a job in private equity, which is what I was doing before business school. And through a number of reasons, right? A lot of it was like consulting with my personal board of directors. A lot of it was prayer. A lot of it was just gut, like what felt like the right thing to do. It appeared that the goal that I was set on attaining was no longer worth it. And this job for this company in a sector I was pursuing was not really what I wanted to do. And that's an explicit admission that like I had spent 2 years of my life kind of chasing something that didn't end up being what I wanted it to be. And I think that's okay. In life, you have to accept that sometimes you invest time in something that doesn't end up panning out. But you know, knowing that side of investing, now I'm more educated about it, right? And it was because I went through that process that I knew I didn't want to do it after a while. So it's not a total loss. And what I would say is you should identify sunk costs. And another one's like, oh, I've dated this person for 4 years. Gosh, might as well keep dating them, right? That's another idea of a sunk cost. But you should identify sunk costs and just not fall into that trap necessarily.
Yeah. That resonated, and I think it's connected to the prior question around pivots. But in my own experience, one thing that comes to mind is thinking about my mindset when I stepped into BCG. We have a practice area called people and organization, which is connected to my core interests. So my thought was, let me move into BCG and let me just focus on people and organization work, our pop practice, and then ultimately work my way towards becoming a partner. And I started meeting all of the partners that did a significant amount of pop work. And then I realized when I moved over to Singapore, I realized, we don't do as much people and operation work in Asia structurally. So now I had to ask myself, okay, do I see myself staying in this consulting role and becoming a partner at BCG? If you had asked me that question, 2 years ago, the answer is, yeah, I could see that being an outcome. If you ask me that question now, that doesn't seem like an outcome that's going to happen. And it's just because the work I want to do isn't, happens to not be in Asia and happens to not be in Singapore. And as I think about my own prioritization, I really appreciate the quality of life in Singapore. So I've started to think, okay, now let me try and think about how can I mold my career in a way that allows me to remain based in Singapore. And now as I'm thinking about it, doing people and organization consulting isn't going to be a viable path. So I have to kind of take this thing that I thought was going to be my path, kind of throw it out. You're not wasting it, right? The time and the energy that I spent thinking about that helps set me up for other opportunities, articulate what I'm looking for. And ultimately I pivoted. I'm still with BCG, but I pivoted out of consulting and now into a more specialized role called the Leadership Institute, where we're helping our clients actually think about how we can help them make that transition from CEO -1 to taking on more responsibility and ultimately becoming the CEO of their organization, and what they will need to do to kind of ready themselves for that. And designing, my role is really around developing the content that these executives go through and so forth. And so that's not really the path that I'm in now is not a path that takes somebody to being a partner at BCG. And so it's a trade-off that I made. And I'm able to focus on the type of work that I do, but I have to kind of get rid of this prior vision that I had for myself. And so that sunk cost example that Calvin is given, I think it's really important because you do have to know when to let go of something. And especially we paint these very vivid pictures for ourselves, which I think is part of what makes these experiences that we have feel like either a failure or a success, is because the level of granularity in the visions that we paint for ourselves can be so specific that if we don't achieve that outcome, we feel like it's a failure. But to the extent that you're able to take that step back and think about the process, what have you learned over the past few years and all of this stuff, you can start to repurpose some of these experiences in your head really as learning experiences as opposed to failures. And I find that to be helpful. I'm really mindful of time here, so maybe we'll close. I don't see any other hands raised, so we'll close here. But before closing, Calvin, any closing thoughts, anything that you'd want to share that we haven't covered yet?
No, I mean, I'm appreciative that everybody took the time to listen to us today. I'm available to stay in touch if anybody wants to reach out. I'm always happy to be helpful. This is a particularly difficult season in my life in terms of time management, as I'm working through a live deal, and then we have a 1-year-old. But wanted to thank everybody for getting on the phone and listening to us talk tonight. Yeah, I'd echo that. And thank you, Calvin, so much for joining for this conversation. I always really appreciate the conversations that we have. Gary, thank you so much for all of the prep in terms of talking through some of this with Calvin and I, and for all the help with the other Zoom events and so forth. Wei, I see you're on the line as well. Thank you for helping just prep this also. And Erica, Jen, Valentina, and Scott for the questions. Really appreciate it. So with that, please do feel free to stay in touch. Send me a message on LinkedIn, send Calvin a message on LinkedIn. Happy to stay in touch.